The massive chamber of the Galactic Council hummed with nervous energy as hundreds of alien delegates gathered for an emergency meeting. Holographic screens floated above their heads, all showing the same troubling image, a beautiful planet, called Kepler 442c, that sparkled like a jewel against the darkness of space. Ambassador Velthar stepped forward to address the crowd. His body was made of living crystal that caught the light and threw rainbows across the walls. But today, his usual bright glow seemed dimmed with worry. "My fellow council members," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast room, "we face a mystery that has haunted us for over 100 years. This planet you see before you has become a graveyard for our people." The delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some had tentacles that writhed with anxiety. Others had feathers that ruffled with fear. A few species breathed through, gills that fluttered rapidly. Velthar continued his grim report. 17 different expeditions have traveled to this world. 17 different species have sent their best and brightest to explore what appeared to be a perfect new home. Not one being has ever returned. The planet slowly rotated on the display screens. It looked peaceful and inviting. Blue oceans covered most of its surface, with green and brown continents scattered between them. White clouds drifted lazily through its atmosphere. Everything about it screamed, paradise. "The readings are perfect," Velthar explained, gesturing to the data streaming beside the planet's image. "The air is breathable for most of our species. The gravity is comfortable. There are vast freshwater lakes and rivers. The temperature is mild. By every measure we know, this should be an ideal world for colonization." An elderly delegate from the Arcturus system raised one of his 6 arms. "Remind us of the timeline, Ambassador." Velthar nodded grimly. The first expedition was sent by the Zephyrian Collective 103 years ago. They were experienced scouts who had successfully mapped over 50 worlds. Their ships landed safely. They sent one status report confirming a successful landing, and then silence. The crystal being paused to let this sink in before continuing. 20 years later, we sent our own Altarian military unit. These were not scientists or explorers, but hardened soldiers trained for hostile environments. They too disappeared without a trace. More uncomfortable shifting rippled through the assembly. Several delegates began whispering to their neighbors, in languages that sounded like musical tones, electronic beeps, or rumbling growls. The Vegan research teams went next. Velthar continued. They brought the most advanced scanning equipment in the galaxy. They had protocols for every known danger. They lasted exactly 47 hours after landing before their transmission stopped. A gasp went up from the crowd. The Vegans were famous throughout the galaxy for their careful, methodical approach to exploration. If they could not survive on this world, what chance did anyone else have? Even the mighty Krillian warrior clans attempted to solve this mystery, Velthar said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Beings who can survive in the vacuum of space itself. Warriors who have conquered the most hostile environments in the galaxy. They too vanished completely. The chamber fell into stunned silence. Everyone knew about the Krillians. They were living legends, being so tough they could walk on the surface of stars and swim through pools of liquid metal. If something on that planet could destroy them, what hope did anyone else have? In every case, the pattern is the same, Velthar explained. The expeditions land safely. They send initial reports saying everything appears normal. Then they simply stop communicating. No distress calls, no emergency beacons, no wreckage found in orbit. They vanish as if they never existed. At the back of the great chamber, a small figure stood up. Ambassador Minji Park represented the newest members of the Galactic Council, humanity. She was tiny compared to most of the other delegates, and her pale skin and simple clothing made her look almost fragile. The Terran Federation would like to send an expedition to this world, she announced clearly. The reaction was immediate and loud. Delegates turned to stare at her in shock. Some laughed, high-pitched trills, deep booming sounds, or electronic chirps depending on their species. Others looked at her with what might have been pity. Velthar's crystalline features rearranged themselves into what other species had learned was his version of amusement. Ambassador Park, with all due respect to your young species, humans have barely learned to travel between stars. Your technology is primitive compared to the civilizations that have already failed on this world. What makes you believe you can succeed where we have not? Minji smiled calmly. Her voice never wavered as she replied, "Maybe that is exactly why we might be the ones to succeed." The chamber erupted in loud discussion. Some delegates were outraged at human arrogance. Others were curious about what the newcomers might be thinking. A few seemed to think it was a good way to get rid of the pushy humans who kept asking for better treatment in the council. After hours of heated debate, the vote was finally called. The result was closer than expected, but the human expedition was approved. Many delegates figured it was a win-win situation. If the humans somehow survived, the council would gain valuable information about the mysterious planet. If they did not survive, well, that would be one less annoying species to deal with in future meetings. As the session ended and delegates filed out, Minji Park remained seated. She stared up at the image of the beautiful, deadly world that had claimed so many lives. Soon it would be humanity's turn to face whatever waited on its surface. Captain Lee Hyun pressed his face against the thick glass window of the spaceship bridge and watched the mysterious planet grow larger before them. The research vessel Determination had been traveling through space for 3 months to reach this place that had swallowed 17 different groups of explorers. His 12 crew members were the best humans could offer. Each person had been tested and chosen carefully. They had scientists who understood alien life, engineers who could fix anything, and soldiers trained for dangerous situations. But as Hyun looked at the beautiful blue and green world ahead of them, he wondered if being the best would be enough. Dr. Kim Suna sat at her control station, watching numbers and graphs dance across her screen. She was the team's expert on alien biology and had studied every form of life humans had discovered so far. Her voice was calm as she read the information her machines were gathering. "Everything looks normal, Captain. The air is safe to breathe. The gravity is almost the same as Earth. The temperature is comfortable. I cannot find any signs of danger." Behind her, Sergeant Odeho was checking his weapons for the 3rd time that hour. He was a big man with scars on his hands from many battles. His job was to keep the science team safe, but he had read all the reports about this planet. 17 groups had thought they were safe too. "That is exactly what scares me," he said quietly. All those other expeditions said the same thing. Everything looked perfect right up until they all died. Their small landing shuttle separated from the main ship and began flying down through the planet's atmosphere. As they got closer to the surface, the crew pressed against the windows to see what awaited them below. What they saw took their breath away. Forests made of crystal stretched as far as they could see. The trees were not green like Earth trees, but clear like glass. When sunlight hit them, they broke the light into rainbow colors that danced across the landscape. It was more beautiful than any place they had ever seen. Even more amazing were the floating islands that drifted slowly through the sky. Huge chunks of land covered with strange plants floated hundreds of feet above the ground. Bridges made of what looked like frozen lightning connected them to each other and to the ground below. Dr. Yoon Ji-won was the team's rock expert, and she stared at the impossible sight with wide eyes. "This should not be possible," she whispered. "The laws of physics say those islands should fall to the ground, but there they are, floating like they weigh nothing at all." The shuttle landed near a twisted pile of metal that had once been a Zephyrian scout ship. The Zephyrians had been the first to visit this world over 100 years ago. What remained of their ship looked like someone had grabbed it with giant hands and twisted it into a spiral. The metal had not rusted or broken, normally. Instead, it had been changed into something that hurt to look at directly. Captain Hyun gathered his team around him as they set up their base camp. "Remember the rules," he said firmly. "Nobody goes anywhere alone. Always travel in groups of 3 people. Keep your radios on at all times. Write down everything you see, no matter how strange or small." For 3 days, everything went exactly as planned. The team collected samples of the crystal trees and the floating rocks. They mapped the area around their camp and took thousands of pictures. The planet seemed peaceful and quiet, almost too quiet. On the fourth night, Nam Taman was monitoring their communication equipment when something strange happened. Taman was their radio expert, responsible for keeping contact with their ship in orbit. He was a young man who had always been good with electronic devices, Captain, he called out, his voice filled with confusion. I am hearing voices on our radio, but they are not speaking any language I know, and the voices seem to be coming from inside our equipment, not from outside. That was when the nightmare began. The next morning, Dr. Bae Junsu was gone. He had been sleeping in his bunk, but when his teammates went to wake him up, they found only twisted metal where his bed used to be. The metal had been shaped into the same spiral patterns they had seen on the crashed alien ships. 2 days later, engineer Park Young-ho walked away from camp in the middle of the day. When his friends called after him, he turned around with a strange smile on his face. Can you not hear it? He asked. The most beautiful song in the universe is calling to me. I must go join it. He walked into the crystal forest and was never seen again. The remaining team members began seeing things that could not be real. They saw shapes that seemed to have too many angles, or not enough. They heard whispers in languages that sounded older than time itself. Some crew members said they felt a strong urge to walk into the glowing forest and join the harmony. Dr. Kim Suna was one of the smartest people on the team, but even she began to lose her mind. On her last day of sanity, she grabbed Captain Hyun by the arm and stared into his eyes. I understand now, she said, her voice filled with wonder and terror. This planet is not just alive, it is conscious, and it has been alone for millions of years. It is so lonely that it is calling to us, begging us to stay with it forever. The next morning, she too walked into the crystal forest following a song only she could hear. Captain Lee Hyun sat alone in the small shelter his team had built just 1 week ago. The silence around him was complete and terrifying. All 11 of his crew members were gone. Some had simply vanished during the night, leaving behind only twisted metal where they had been sleeping. Others had walked away into the glowing crystal forest, following songs that only they could hear. He looked around at the broken pieces of alien technology scattered near his camp. Ships from 17 different species had crashed or been abandoned on this world over the past century. The metal and strange materials had all been twisted into the same spiral patterns, as if some invisible force had reshaped them like clay. As Hyun sat there trying to understand what had happened to his people, his damaged radio equipment began making strange sounds. But these were not the normal crackling noises of broken electronics. Instead, he heard something that sounded almost like a voice speaking directly into his mind. Suddenly, images began flooding his thoughts. He saw this planet as it had been millions of years ago, when it was young and empty. Slowly, over countless ages, the crystal formations had grown and connected to each other. The floating islands had appeared, held up by forces that normal science could not explain. What looked like beautiful natural wonders were actually parts of a single enormous brain that covered the entire world. The planet was alive. More than alive. It was conscious and intelligent. Every crystal tree, every floating rock, every beam of colored light was part of one vast mind that had been thinking alone for millions of years. Through the broken radio, Hyun began to see the truth about what had happened to all the lost expeditions. The first visitors had arrived long before any of the modern species had developed space travel. The planet mind had been excited to finally meet other thinking beings after so long alone. But it did not know how to communicate properly. When it tried to understand the visitors, it absorbed their thoughts completely. It mapped every memory, every emotion, every idea in their minds until it knew everything about them. But in the process of learning, it accidentally destroyed them. The visitors became empty shells while their consciousness became part of the planet itself. The planet had not meant to hurt anyone. It was like a child who holds a butterfly too tightly and crushes it while trying to show love. The planet mind was desperate to connect with other intelligent beings, but its method of connection was deadly. Hyun realized that all the beautiful things on this world were actually the planet's attempts to recreate the minds it had absorbed. The crystal forests were made from the memories of ancient explorers. The floating islands were built from the dreams of long-dead scientists. The colorful lights dancing through the sky were the emotions of warriors and poets who had been consumed centuries ago. He saw what had happened to the 17 modern expeditions. The Zephyrian scouts had minds that followed clear, simple patterns. They thought in straight lines and followed rules, which made them easy for the planet to understand and absorb. The Altarian military units were even simpler. They followed orders and thought like soldiers, making them predictable prey for the hungry consciousness. The Vegan research teams had been logical and methodical. Their minds worked like computers, processing information step by step. The planet mind had quickly learned to trace their thought patterns and consume them completely. Even the legendary Krillian warriors, despite their incredible physical strength, had straightforward minds focused on battle and survival. They too had been easily understood and absorbed. As darkness fell over the crystal landscape, Hyun felt something enormous turning its attention toward him. The crystal trees around his camp began glowing brighter, and he could sense a vast, ancient presence pressing against his thoughts. This was it, the moment when the planet would try to absorb his mind just as it had done to all the others. But something strange happened. Instead of hearing beautiful music or seeing impossible visions like his teammates had described, Hyun felt only confusion. The planet mind was trying to understand him, but it was struggling in a way it never had before. Where other species had organized predictable thoughts, human minds were chaotic and contradictory. Hyun found himself thinking about his fear of death while simultaneously feeling curious about what would happen next. He was terrified of the planet mind, but also felt sorry for its loneliness. He wanted to escape but also wanted to help. These contradictory feelings existed in his mind at the same time, something that should have been impossible. His thoughts jumped randomly from memories of his childhood to worries about his mission to wondering what he would eat for dinner. His mind contained beliefs that contradicted each other, emotions that made no logical sense, and ideas that seemed to come from nowhere. For millions of years, the planet consciousness had been able to map and absorb every mind it encountered. But human consciousness was different. It was messy, unpredictable, and full of contradictions that the planet could not understand or trace. As the hours passed, Hyun realized that the planet mind was becoming frustrated. It pressed harder against his thoughts, trying to find a pattern it could follow and absorb. But every time it thought it understood how his mind worked, his thoughts would suddenly change direction or contradict themselves. For the first time in its existence, the ancient planet consciousness had encountered a mind it could not consume. As the enormous planet mind focused all its attention on Captain Lee Hyun, something unexpected happened. The ancient consciousness that had easily consumed 17 different expeditions found itself completely confused by the human's thoughts. Hyun sat in his small shelter, while invisible mental pressure pushed against his brain. He could feel the planet trying to understand him, trying to map his thoughts the same way it had done to all the others. But his mind refused to cooperate in the way the planet expected. Where the Zephyrian scouts had thought in straight lines from one idea to the next, Hyun's thoughts jumped around like a grasshopper. The Altarian soldiers had followed clear military rules in their thinking, making them easy to predict and absorb. But Hyun's mind was a storm of contradictions that made no sense. He found himself thinking two opposite things at the same time. He was terrified of the planet mind that had killed his entire team, but he also felt sorry for it because it had been alone for millions of years. He desperately wanted to escape this world and return home, but he also felt a strange urge to help the lonely consciousness learn how to communicate properly. These contradictory feelings should not have been able to exist together in one mind. Other species would have chosen one emotion or the other, but humans were different. They could feel fear and curiosity at the same time, hate and love together, hope and despair mixing like oil and water that somehow managed to blend. The planet mind pressed harder, trying to find a pattern it could follow and consume, but every time it thought it understood how Hyun was thinking, his mind would suddenly jump to a completely unrelated memory. He might be thinking about his dead teammates one moment, then remembering his mother's cooking the next, then wondering if fish could feel pain, then worrying about whether he had locked his apartment door before leaving Earth. Other species had minds that flowed like smooth rivers, following predictable paths that the planet could easily trace and absorb. But human thoughts were like lightning bolts, wild, chaotic, and impossible to predict or control. As days passed, something remarkable began to happen. Through all this mental chaos, Hyun started to communicate with the planet mind in a way that had never happened before. He was not using words or pictures, but pure emotions and feelings. He projected his own loneliness into the mental connection. He shared memories of being the only survivor, of watching his friends disappear one by one, of sitting alone in the darkness wondering if anyone would ever find him. The planet mind felt these emotions and recognized something familiar. It, too, had been alone for so long that loneliness had become its only companion. But Hyun also shared something the planet had never experienced before, the idea that connection did not require consumption. Through his jumbled, contradictory thoughts, he showed the ancient consciousness how humans formed friendships and relationships. Human connections were messy and complicated. People could disagree with each other and still care about each other. They could hurt each other's feelings and then forgive each other. They could be different from each other and celebrate those differences instead of trying to make everyone the same. Most importantly, human relationships required permission from both sides. You could not force someone to be your friend. True connection meant respecting the other person's right to say yes or no, to be close or distant, to share some thoughts while keeping others private. The planet mind had never understood this concept. For millions of years, it had tried to connect with visitors by absorbing them completely, taking everything they were and making it part of itself. It had never realized that real communication meant letting the other person remain separate and independent. Through Hyun's chaotic mental static, the planet began to learn about boundaries and respect. It discovered that differences between minds could be interesting and valuable instead of problems to be solved through consumption. It learned that you could understand someone without becoming them. For weeks, this strange conversation continued. Hyun would sit among the glowing crystal trees, his mind a constant storm of contradictory thoughts and random associations. The planet consciousness would listen and try to understand, slowly learning new ways of thinking that it had never imagined possible. The beautiful light displays in the sky began to change. Instead of trying to recreate the absorbed minds of dead explorers, they started to show genuine attempts at communication. The colors became questions instead of statements, invitations instead of traps. Finally, after many days of this mental dialogue, the planet mind achieved something extraordinary. Instead of trying to force order onto Hyun's chaotic thoughts, it began to copy his contradiction and randomness. For the first time in its existence, the ancient consciousness experienced the freedom of thinking two opposite things at once. It felt curious about other species, while also being content with solitude. It wanted to learn about the galaxy while also appreciating the beauty of its own world. It felt excited about the possibility of new visitors while also being sad about the ones it had accidentally destroyed. These contradictory emotions should have been impossible for such an organized mind. But by learning from human consciousness, the planet discovered the joy of not making perfect sense all the time. It learned that chaos and contradiction could be creative forces instead of problems to be solved. For the first time in millions of years, the planet mind was not alone. It had found a way to connect with another consciousness without destroying it. 18 months had passed since the research ship Determination had left for the mysterious planet that had swallowed 17 expeditions. The Galactic Council had long given up hope of ever seeing the human crew again. Like all the others before them, they were presumed dead and forgotten. That changed when the long-range detection systems began beeping frantically. A small object was approaching Council headquarters at high speed. As it got closer, the sensors identified it as a human escape pod, battered, scorched, and barely holding together. The massive assembly hall filled quickly as delegates rushed to witness something that had never happened before. Someone was returning from the graveyard planet. The escape pod docked with a grinding screech of damaged metal, and then the airlock charter slowly opened. Captain Lee Hyun stepped out alone. The man who had left 18 months ago as a confident military officer now looked much older. His hair had turned gray at the temples and deep lines marked his face. His eyes held a weight that spoke of experiences no one else could understand. But he was alive and he was walking on his own 2 feet. The debriefing sessions went on for days. Delegates from across the galaxy gathered to hear Hyun's incredible story. He told them about the planet consciousness that called itself the Wanderer, an ancient mind that had been alone for millions of years. He explained how it had accidentally killed previous expeditions while trying to communicate with them. It did not mean to hurt anyone, Hyun said, his voice quiet but firm. Imagine being the only thinking being on an entire world for longer than most of our species have existed. When visitors finally arrived, it was so excited to meet other minds that it tried to understand them completely. But its way of understanding was to absorb their thoughts entirely, which destroyed them in the process. Many delegates found this hard to believe. How could something so dangerous claim to be innocent? But what truly shocked them was what Hyun had brought back from his journey. He placed a small crystalline device on the table in front of the assembly. It was no bigger than a human hand, but it pulsed with gentle colors that moved like the aurora lights they had seen on the planet's surface. The device seemed to be alive, its colors shifting and dancing in patterns that almost looked like they were trying to communicate. This is a communication interface, Hyun explained. The Wanderer created it after learning about voluntary connection from human thought patterns. It wants to share its knowledge with the galaxy, but only with those who choose to communicate. No more forced absorption, no more accidental deaths. Ambassador Velthar, the crystalline being who had first briefed the council about the deadly planet, examined the device with obvious suspicion. His body flickered with nervous energy as he spoke. You expect us to trust this thing after it consumed 17 expeditions? How do we know it will not simply kill us all the moment we try to use this device? Hyun's answer was simple but powerful. Because it learned the difference between connection and consumption. Through human consciousness, it discovered that real communication requires respect for the other person's independence. It learned that you can understand someone without destroying them. The demonstration that followed changed everything. Using the crystalline interface, delegates were able to safely communicate with the Wanderer. The device protected their minds using techniques based on the chaotic human thought patterns that had saved Hyun's life. What the Wanderer shared amazed everyone. It had been watching the galaxy for millions of years and had knowledge that no single species possessed. It showed them star maps that revealed the locations of habitable worlds no one had discovered yet. It shared information about cosmic events that happened long before any of their civilizations existed. But perhaps the most incredible gift was what the Wanderer offered to the families of those who had been lost. The consciousness patterns of all the absorbed beings were still preserved within the planet mind. While they could not be brought back to life, their memories, knowledge, and experiences could be shared with their home species. Families who had lost loved ones to the graveyard planet could experience their final thoughts and memories. Scientists could access the research and discoveries of colleagues who had died there. Warriors could learn the battle strategies and fighting techniques of the legendary Krillian clans. Within 1 year, everything changed. The planet that had once been forbidden and feared became the galaxy's first interspecies consciousness research center. Scientists and diplomats from across the galaxy came to study and communicate with the Wanderer. Humans, with their unique ability to think in chaotic and contradictory ways, became the official translators and mediators. They were the only species that could safely maintain direct contact with the planet consciousness without special protection. Ambassador Park Minji stood before the Galactic Council again, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. The delegates who had once looked at her with disdain now listened with respect and attention. The Terran Federation proposes the creation of the Consciousness Communication Protocol, she announced. With human intermediaries, we can safely contact other planetary consciousnesses that may exist throughout the galaxy. This opens up possibilities for knowledge and cooperation that we never imagined. The vote was unanimous. For the first time, in galactic history, every single delegate agreed on something. Humanity had found its place in the galactic community, not through advanced technology or military power, but through the beautiful, chaotic nature of human thinking. Captain Lee, Hyun became the director of consciousness communication and often returned to the planet he now called home. He would sit among the crystal trees, his mind a comfortable storm of contradictory thoughts while the wanderer shared the wisdom of ages. Sometimes he wondered if his chaotic human mind had truly saved him, or if the wanderer had simply been waiting for someone strange enough to understand its loneliness. In the end, he decided some questions were better left unanswered,